On the morning of Saturday the 15th of July, we set off to visit the field of the ever-memorable and glorious Battle of Waterloo. After passing the ramparts, we descended to the pretty little village of Ixelles, embosomed in woods and situated close to the margin of a still, glassy piece of water. From thence, we ascended a steep hill and immediately entered the deep shades of the forest of Soigny, which extends about 9 miles from Brussels. The morning was bright and beautiful. The summer sun sported through the branches which met above our heads and gleamed upon the silver trunks of the lofty beech trees. On either side, woodland roads continually struck in various directions through the forest, so seldom trodden that they were covered with the brightest verdure. At intervals, neat, whitewashed cottages and little villages by the roadside enlivened the forest scenery. We passed through Vividol, La Petite Espinette, La Grande Espinette, Longueville, and several other hamlets whose names I have forgotten. Upon the doors of many of the cottages we passed were written in white chalk the names of the officers who had used them for temporary quarters on their way to the battle, or who had been carried there for shelter in returning, when wounded and unable to proceed further. Many we knew had died in these miserable abodes, but all the survivors, excepting 1 or 2 of the most severely wounded, had now been removed to Brussels. It was impossible to retrace, without emotion, the very road by which our brave troops had marched out to battle 3 weeks before, and by which thousands had been brought back, covered with wounds, in pain and torture. They alone of all that gallant army had returned. Thousands had met a glorious death upon the field of battle, and the victorious survivors had pursued their onward march to the capital of France. I could not help asking myself, as we proceeded along, what would have been the consequences if the French and British armies had happened to encounter each other in the midst of this forest, instead of meeting, as they did, a few miles beyond it. Had our troops been a little later in leaving Brussels on the morning of the 16th of June, this must inevitably have been the case, for it was impossible that the advanced guard of Belgic troops, which was stationed at the outpost of Quatre Bras, could have sustained the attack of the French, or have delayed their progress for any length of time. But if the hostile armies had encountered each other here, it would have been impossible that a general action could have taken place. The thick, entangled underwood makes all entrance into the forest impracticable, and if they had attempted to fight, the road would soon have been choked up with dead. Yet the English, I imagine, would not have retreated, since, if they had, they must either have abandoned Brussels to the enemy, or fought under its very walls, and whether the French would have retreated till they came to open ground, or how they would have manoeuvred in such a situation, it was impossible for an unmilitary head like mine even to form a conjecture. During the battle, all the cottages and villages by the wayside had been deserted by their inhabitants, who fled in consternation into the woods, in expectation of the victory and immediate advance of the French, from whom they looked for no mercy. The road had been so dreadfully cut up with the heavy rains and the incessant travelling upon it, that notwithstanding 3 weeks of summer weather had now elapsed since the battle, the chaussée in the centre was worn into ruts upon the hard pavement, and in many places it was still so deep that the horses could scarcely drag us through. The unpaved way on each side of the chaussée was perfectly impassable. Along the whole way, shattered wheels and broken remains of wagons still lay, buried among the mud. Their demolition was one of the many consequences that resulted from the violent panic with which the men who were left in charge of the baggage were seized towards the close of the battle. It was originally caused, I understood, by the Belgic cavalry, great numbers of whom fled in the heat of the desperate attack made by the French upon our army in front of Mont-Saint-Jean before the Prussians came up. They were rallied and brought back by some British officers, But, unable to stand the dreadful onset of the French, they turned about again and fled in irretrievable confusion, trampling upon the wounded and the dying in their speed, and spreading the alarm that the battle was lost. With troops less steady, with any other troops in short than the British, the example of flight, joined to such an alarm at this critical moment, might have occasioned the loss of the battle in reality. The men stationed in the rear in charge of the baggage, who knew nothing of what was going forward, believed at once the report, and, without stopping a moment to ascertain its truth, they set off at full speed. If the battle was lost, it was clearly their business to run away, and they could not be accused of neglecting this part of their duty. Following the example of the Belgians, they all set off full gallop in the utmost confusion, pell-mell, along the road to Brussels. Nothing is so infectious, nothing so rapid in its progress as fear. The panic increased every moment. The terrified fugitives overtook the carts filled with wounded, and encountered wagons and troops and military supplies coming up to the field. It was impossible to pass. The road, confined on each side by the thickly woven and impenetrable underwood, was speedily choked up. Those who were proceeding to the army insisted upon going one way, and those who were running away from it persisted in going the other. The confusion surpassed all description, till at last, amidst the crash of wagons, the imprecations of the drivers, and the cries of the soldiers, a battle took place, and many were the broken heads and bruises, and various were the wounds and contusions received in this inglorious fray. It is even said, and I fear with truth, that some lives were lost. The baggage was abandoned and scattered along the road. The wagons were thrown one upon another into the woods and over the banks by the roadside. The horses, half killed, were left to perish, and the wounded were deserted. Over every obstacle these panic-struck people, frantic with fear, forced their way, and pursued by nothing but their own terrified imaginations, they arrived at Brussels, proclaiming the dreadful news that the battle was lost and the French advancing. The fearful tidings extended from thence even into Holland, and thus, in consequence of the cowardice of some Belgians and baggage men, the last and most dreadful alarm of Sunday night was spread over the whole country. The road, the whole way through the forest of Soignies, was marked with vestiges of the dreadful scenes which had recently taken place upon it. Bones of unburied horses and pieces of broken carts and harness were scattered about. At every step we met with the remains of some tattered clothes which had once been a soldier's, shoes, belts, and scabbards, infantry caps battered to pieces, broken feathers, and Highland bonnets covered with mud, were strewn along the roadside, or thrown among the trees. These mournful relics had belonged to the wounded who had attempted to crawl from the fatal field, and who, unable to proceed farther, had laid down and died upon the ground now marked by their graves, if holes dug by the wayside and hardly covered with earth deserved that name. The bodies of the wounded who died in the wagons on the way to Brussels had also been thrown out and hastily interred. Thus the road between Waterloo and Brussels was one long uninterrupted charnel house. The smell, the whole way through the forest, was extremely offensive, and in some places scarcely bearable. Deep, stagnant pools of red, putrid water, mingled with mortal remains, betrayed the spot where the bodies of men and horses had mingled together in death. We passed a large cross on the left side of the road, which had been erected in ancient times to mark the place where one human being had been murdered. How many had now sunk around it in agony, and breathed, unnoticed and unpitied, their dying groans. It was surrounded by many a fresh-made, melancholy mound, which had served for the soldier's humble grave. But no monument points out to future times the bloody spot where they expired. No cross stands to implore from the passenger the tribute of a tear, or call forth a pious prayer for the repose of the departed spirits who here perished for their country. The melancholy vestiges of death and destruction became more frequent, the pools of putrid water more deep, and the smell more offensive, as we approached Waterloo, which is situated at the distance of about 3 leagues, or scarcely 9 miles, from Brussels. Before we left the forest, the church of Waterloo appeared in view at the end of the avenue of trees. It is a singular building, much in the form of a Chinese temple, and built of red brick. On leaving the wood, we passed the trampled and deep-marked bivouac, where the heavy baggage wagons, tilted carts and tumbrils had been stationed during the battle, and from which they had taken flight with such precipitation. Even here cannonballs had lodged in the trees, but had passed over the roofs of the cottages. We entered the village which has given its name to the most glorious battle ever recorded in the annals of history. It was the headquarters of the British Army on the nights preceding and following the battle. It was here the dispositions for the action were made on Saturday afternoon. It was here on Monday morning the dispatches were written, which perhaps contain the most brief and unassuming account a conqueror ever penned, of the most glorious victory that a conqueror ever won. Waterloo consists of a sort of long, irregular street of whitewashed cottages through which the road runs. Some of them are detached, and some built in rows. A small house, with a neat, little square flower garden before it, on the right hand, was pointed out to us as the quarters of Lord Uxbridge, and the place where he remained after the amputation of his leg, until well enough to bear removal. His name, and those of His Grace the Duke of Wellington, His Royal Highness the Prince of Orange, and other pompous titles, were written on the doors of these little thatched cottages. We also read the lamented names of Sir Thomas Picton, Sir Alexander Gordon, Sir William de Lancey, and Sir William Ponsonby, who had slept there the night before the battle, and many others who now sleep in the bed of honour. Volumes of sermons and homilies upon the instability of human life could not have spoken such affecting and convincing eloquence to our hearts as the sight of these names, thus traced in chalk, which had been more durable than the lives of these gallant men. After leaving Waterloo, the ground rises. The wood, which had opened, again surrounded us, though in a more straggling and irregular manner, and it was not till we arrived at the little village of Mont-Saint-Jean, more than a mile beyond Waterloo, that we finally quitted the shade of the forest and entered upon the open field where the battle had been fought. During the whole of the action, the rear of the left wing of our army rested upon this little village, from which the French named the battle. We gazed with particular interest at a farmhouse, at the farthest extremity of the village nearest the field, on the left side of the road, with its walls and gates and roofs still bearing the vestiges of the cannonballs that had pierced them. Every part of this house and offices was filled with wounded British officers, and here our friend Major L. was conveyed in excruciating agony upon an old blanket, supported by the bayonets of 4 of his soldiers. On the right, we saw at some distance the church of Braine-l'Alleud, which was in the rear of the extremity of the right wing of our army. From the top of the steeple of this church, the battle might have been seen more distinctly than from any other place, if anyone had possessed coolness and hardihood sufficient to have stood the calm spectator of such a scene, and if some cannonball had not stopped his observations by carrying off his head. Alighting from the carriage, which we sent back to the barrière of Mont-Saint, Jean, we walked past the place where the beaten-down corn and the whole appearance of the ground would alone have been sufficient to have indicated that it had been the bivouac of the British Army on the tempestuous night before the battle, when, after marching and fighting all day beneath a burning sun, they lay all night in this swampy piece of ground, under torrents of rain. We rapidly hurried on until our progress was arrested by a long line of immense fresh-made graves. We suddenly stopped. We stood rooted to the spot. We gazed around us in silence. For the emotions that at this moment swelled, our hearts were too deep for utterance. We felt that we stood on the field of battle. And these, then, are the graves of the brave. At length, mournfully exclaimed one of the party, after a silence of some minutes, hastily wiping away some natural tears. Look how they extend all along in front of this broken, beaten-down hedge. What tremendous slaughter! This is, or rather was, said an officer who was our conductor, the hedge of La Haye Sainte. The ground in front of it, and the narrow lane that runs behind it, were occupied by Sir Thomas Picton's division, which formed the left wing of the army, and it was in leading forward his men to a glorious and successful charge against a furious attack made by an immense force of the enemy that this gallant and lamented officer fell. He was shot through the head, and died instantly, without uttering a word or a groan. We gazed at the opposite height, or rather bank, upon which the French army was posted. We thought of the feelings with which our gallant soldiers must have viewed it before the action commenced, when it was covered with the innumerable legions of France ranged in arms against them. The solemn and portentous stillness which precedes the bursting of the tempest is nothing to the awful sublimity of a moment such as this. The threatening columns of that immense army, which their valour had destroyed and scattered, were then ready to pour down upon them. The cannon taken in the action, which now stood in the field before us under the guard of a single British soldier, were then turned against them. The field pieces taken by the Prussians in the pursuit were not here, but 130 pieces of cannon belonging to the British, and taken by them on the field of battle, still remained here. We went to examine them. They were beautiful pieces of ordnance, inscribed with very whimsical names, and some of them with the revolutionary words of liberté, égalité, fraternité. Our own artillery, which was admirably served, had been principally placed in 2 lines upon the ridge of the gentle slope on which our army was stationed. About 4 o'clock in the afternoon, the first line of guns advanced, and the second took the place which the first had before occupied. It was also placed upon every little eminence over the field, and it did great execution amongst the enemy's ranks. The ground occupied by Sir Thomas Picton's division, on the left of the road from Brussels, is lower than any other part of the British position. It is divided from the more elevated ridge, where the French were posted by a very gentle declivity. To the right, the ground rises, and the hollow irregularly increases, until at Château Hougoumont it becomes a sort of small dell or ravine, and the banks are both high and steep. But the ground occupied by the French is uniformly higher, and decidedly a stronger position than ours. Nothing struck me with more surprise than the confined space in which this tremendous battle had been fought, and this, perhaps, in some measure, contributed to its sanguinary result. The space which divided the 2 armies from the farmhouse of La Haye Sainte, which was occupied by our troops, to La Belle Alliance, which was occupied by theirs, would, I think, scarcely measure 3 furlongs. Not more than half a mile could have intervened between the main body of the French and English armies, and from the extremity of the right to that of the left wing of our army, I should suppose to be little more than a mile. The hedge along which Sir Thomas Picton's division was stationed, and through which the Scots Greys, with the Royals and the Inniskillens, headed by Lord Uxbridge, made their glorious and decisive charge at the close of the action, is almost the only one in the field of battle. The ground is occasionally divided by some shallow ditches, and in one place there is a sort of low mud dyke, which was very much broken and beaten down. This was not on the ground our troops occupied, but rather below the French position, and excepting this, The whole field of battle is unenclosed. The ground is, however, very uneven and broken, and the soil a strong clay. It belongs to different farmers, and bore crops of different kinds of corn, but it is entirely arable land, and, excepting a very small piece on the French side, none of it was in grass. Against the left wing of our army, the attacks of the French were furious and incessant. Bonaparte had stationed opposite to it the chief body of his corps de réserve, and fresh columns of troops continually poured down, without being able to make the smallest impression upon the firm and impenetrable squares which the British regiments formed to receive them. It was Bonaparte's object to turn the left wing of our army and cut it off from the Prussians, with whom a communication was maintained through Ohain, and who were known, at least by the commanders of the British army, to be advancing. The Duke expected them to have joined before 1 o'clock, but it was 7 before they made their appearance. On the top of the ridge in front of the British position, on the left of the road, we traced a long line of tremendous graves, or rather pits, into which hundreds of dead had been thrown as they had fallen in their ranks, without yielding an inch of ground. The effluvia which arose from them, even beneath the open canopy of heaven, was horrible, and the pure west wind of summer, as it passed us, seemed pestiferous. So deadly was the smell that in many places pervaded the field. The fresh-turned clay which covered those pits betrayed how recent had been their formation. From one of them the scanty clods of earth which had covered it had in one place fallen, and the skeleton of a human face was visible. I turned from the spot in indescribable horror, and with a sensation of deadly faintness which I could scarcely overcome. On the opposite side of the road, we scrambled up a perpendicular bank, through which the road had evidently been cut. It was upon this eminence that the Duke of Wellington stood, beneath the memorable tree, from the commencement of the action, surrounded by his staff. It was here, we were told, that in the most critical part of it he rallied the different regiments and led them on again in person to renew the shock of battle. Here we stood some time to survey the field. Immediately before us, nearly in the hollow, was the farmhouse of La Haye Sainte, surrounded by a quadrangular wall full of holes for musketry. At the commencement of the action, it was occupied by the British, and it formed the most advanced post of the left centre of our army. It was gallantly and successfully defended by a detachment of the Light Battalion of the German Legion, until nearly the close of the day, when their ammunition was exhausted. It was impossible to send them a supply, as all communication with them was cut off by the enemy, who at length succeeded in carrying it after a most obstinate resistance. But its brave defenders only resigned its possession with their lives. On the opposite side of the road, a little behind La Haye Sainte, and immediately below the ground occupied by Sir Thomas Picton's division, is a quarry which was surrounded by British artillery at the commencement of the battle. Towards the close of the action, it was filled with the wounded, who had taken refuge in it as a shelter from the shot and shells, and from the charge of the cavalry, when, horrible to relate, a body of French cuirassiers were completely overthrown into this quarry by a furious charge of the British, and horses and riders were rolled in death upon these unfortunate sufferers. The ghastly spectacle which it exhibited next morning was described to me by an eye-witness of this scene of horror. On the left, in the hollow between the two armies, we saw the hamlet of Terre-la-Haye, which was occupied by British troops. Its possession was never disputed by the enemy, although it was close advanced upon their position. Beyond it, still farther to the left, were the woods of Frischemont and the road to Wavre, from which the Prussians issued through a narrow defile and advanced to attack the right flank of the French. These woods bounded the prospect on that side. On the right stood the ruins of Château Hougoumont, concealed from view by a small wood which crowns the hill. It formed the most advanced post of the right centre of our army, and it was defended to the last with efforts of successful valour, almost more than human, against the overpowering numbers and furious attacks of the enemy. The battle commenced here about 11 o'clock. The French, suddenly uncovering a masked battery, opened a tremendous fire upon this part of our position, and advanced to the attack with astonishing impetuosity, led on, it is said, by Jerome Bonaparte in person, while Napoleon viewed it from his station near the observatory on the opposite height. They were completely repulsed by the bravery of General Byng's brigade of guards, but they succeeded in carrying the wood, which was occupied by the Belgic troops. The French, however, after a dreadful struggle, were driven out of the wood again by the Coldstreams and the 3rd Regiment of Guards, and never afterwards were able to regain possession of it. The Black Brunswickers behaved most gallantly in retrieving the consequences of the misconduct of the Belgic troops, and in defending the chateau and the garden. The British Guards performed prodigies of valour, though they suffered most severely. Lieutenant General Cook, Major General Byng, Lord Saltoun, the lamented Colonel Miller, who died as he had lived, a brave and honourable soldier, Captain Adair, Captains Evelyn and Ellis, Colonels Askew, Dashwood and Doyley, with many others, particularly distinguished themselves by their steady gallantry and personal valour. The house was consumed by fire, and numbers of the wounded perished in the flames. Yet the British maintained possession of it to the last, in spite of the incessant and desperate attacks of the enemy, who directed against it a furious fire of shot and shells, under cover of which large bodies of troops advanced continually to the assault, and were driven back again and again with tremendous slaughter. Without the possession of this important post, the right flank of our army could not be attacked. It formed what is called the key of the position. From its elevation it commanded the whole of the ground occupied by our army, and had it been lost, the victory to the French would scarcely have been doubtful. Opposite, but divided from it by a deep hollow, were the heights occupied by the French, upon which, at some distance, and secure from the storm of war, stands the observatory, where Bonaparte stationed himself at the beginning of the action, and whence he issued his orders, and commanded column after column to advance to the charge and rush upon destruction. His invincible legions, his invulnerable cuirassiers, in vain assaulted the position of the British with the most furious and undaunted resolution. In vain the vast tide of battle rolled on like the rocks of their native land. They repelled its rage. Squares of infantry received the onset of the French columns, directed against them a steady and uninterrupted fire of musketry, and stood firm and unshaken beneath the most tremendous showers of shot and shell. Every vacancy caused by death was instantly filled up. The enemy vainly sought for an opening through which they might penetrate the impenetrable phalanx. And when at last they receded from the ineffectual attack, the British cavalry rushed forward to the charge, and, notwithstanding their superiority of numbers, drove them back with immense slaughter. But I am relating the history of the battle, forgetful that I am only describing the field. From the spot where we now stood, I cast my eyes on every side and saw nothing but the dreadful and recent traces of death and devastation. The rich harvests of standing corn, which had covered the scene of action we were contemplating, had been beaten into the earth, and the withered and broken stalks dried in the sun, now presented the appearance of stubble, though blacker and far more bare than any stubble land. In many places the excavations made by the shells had thrown up the earth all around them. The marks of horses' hoofs that had plunged ankle-deep in clay were hardened in the sun, and the feet of men, deeply stamped into the ground, left traces where many a deadly struggle had been. The ground was ploughed up in several places with the charge of the cavalry, and the whole field was literally covered with soldiers' caps, shoes, gloves, belts, and scabbards. Broken feathers battered into the mud, remnants of tattered scarlet or blue cloth, bits of fur and leather, black stocks and haversacks, belonging to the French soldiers, buckles, packs of cards, books, and innumerable papers of every description. I picked up a volume of Candide, a few sheets of sentimental love letters, evidently belonging to some French novel, and many other pages of the same publication were flying over the field in much too muddy a state to be touched. One German Testament, not quite so dirty as many that were lying about, I carried with me nearly the whole day. Printed French military returns, muster rolls, love letters, and washing bills, illegible songs, scattered sheets of military music, epistles without number in praise of l'Empereur, le Grand Napoleon, and filled with the most confident anticipations of victory under his command, were strewed over the field, which had been the scene of his defeat. The quantities of letters and of blank sheets of dirty writing paper were so great that they literally whitened the surface of the earth. The road to Genappe, descending from the front of the British position, where we were now standing, passes the farmhouse of La Haye Sainte and ascends the opposite height, on the summit of which stands La Belle Alliance, which was occupied by the French. We walked down the hill to La Haye Sainte. Its walls and slated roofs were shattered and pierced through in every direction with cannon shot. We could not get admittance into it, for it was completely deserted by its inhabitants. 3 wounded officers of the 42nd and 92nd Regiments were standing here to survey the scene. They had all of them been wounded in the Battle of the 16th. One of them had lost an arm, another was on crutches, and the third seemed to be very ill. Their carriage waited for them, as they were unable to walk. After some conversation with them, we proceeded up the hill to the hamlet of La Belle Alliance. The principal house on the left side of the road was pierced through and through with cannonballs, and the offices behind it were a heap of dust from the fire of the British artillery. Notwithstanding the ruinous state of the house, it was filled with inhabitants. Its broken walls, its looped and windowed wretchedness, might indeed defend them sufficiently well from seasons such as these, when the soft breezes and the bright beams of summer played around it, but against the pelting of the storm. It would afford them but a sorry shelter. It was immediately to be repaired, but I rejoiced that it yet remained in its dilapidated state. The house was filled with vestiges of the battle. Cuirasses, helmets, swords, bayonets, feathers, brass eagles, and crosses of the Legion of Honour were to be purchased here. The house consisted of 3 rooms, 2 in front, and a very small one behind. On the opposite side of the road is a little cottage, forming part of the hamlet of La Belle Alliance, and at a short distance, by the wayside, is another low-roofed cottage, which was pointed out to us as the place where Buonaparte breakfasted on the morning of the battle. Farther along this road, but not in sight, was the village of Planchenoit, which was the headquarters of the French on the night of the 17th. We crossed the field from this place to Château Hougomont, descending to the bottom of the hill, and again ascending the opposite side. Part of our way lay through clover, but I observed that the corn on the French position was not nearly so much beaten down as on the English, which might naturally be expected, as they attacked us incessantly, and we acted on the defensive until that last, general and decisive charge of our whole army was made, before which theirs fled in confusion. In some places, patches of corn nearly as high as myself was standing. Among them I discovered many a forgotten grave, strewed round with melancholy remnants of military attire. While I loitered behind the rest of the party, searching among the corn for some relics worthy of preservation, I beheld a human hand, almost reduced to a skeleton, outstretched above the ground, as if it had raised itself from the grave. My blood ran cold with horror, and for some moments I stood rooted to the spot, unable to take my eyes from this dreadful object or to move away. As soon as I recovered myself, I hastened after my companions, who were far before me, and overtook them just as they entered the wood of Hougoumont. Never shall I forget the dreadful scene of death and destruction which it presented. The broken branches were strewed around, the green beech leaves fallen before their time and stripped by the storm of war, not by the storm of nature, were scattered over the surface of the ground, emblematical of the fate of the thousands who had fallen on the same spot in the summer of their days. The return of spring will dress the wood of Hougoumont once more in vernal beauty, and succeeding years will see it flourish. But when shall spring visit the mouldering urn? Oh, when shall it dawn on the night of the grave? The trunks of the trees had been pierced in every direction with cannonballs. In some of them I counted the holes, where upwards of 30 had lodged. Yet they still lived, they still bore their verdant foliage, and the birds still sang amidst their boughs. Beneath their shade, the harebell and violet were waving their slender heads, and the wild raspberry at their roots was ripening its fruit. I gathered some of it with the bitter reflection that amidst the destruction of human life, these worthless weeds and flowers had escaped uninjured. Melancholy were the vestiges of death that continually met our eyes. The carnage here had indeed been dreadful. Amongst the long grass lay remains of broken arms, shreds of gold lace, torn epaulets, and pieces of cartridge boxes, and upon the tangled branches of the brambles fluttered many a tattered remnant of a soldier's coat. At the outskirts of the wood, and around the ruined walls of the chateau, huge piles of human ashes were heaped up, some of which were still smoking. The countryman told us that so great were the numbers of the slain that it was impossible entirely to consume them. Pits had been dug, into which they had been thrown, but they were obliged to be raised far above the surface of the ground. These dreadful heaps were covered with piles of wood, which were set on fire, so that underneath the ashes lay numbers of human bodies unconsumed. The chateau itself, the beautiful seat of a Belgic gentleman, had been set on fire by the explosion of shells during the action, which had completed the destruction occasioned by a most furious cannonade. Its broken walls and falling roof presented a most melancholy spectacle. Not melancholy merely from its being a pile of ruins, but from the vestiges it presented of that tremendous and recent warfare by which those ruins had been caused. Its huge blackened beams had fallen in every direction upon the crumbling heaps of stone and plaster, which were intermixed with broken pieces of the marble flags, the carved cornices, and the gilded mirrors that once ornamented it. We went into the garden, which had sustained comparatively little injury, while everything around it was laid waste. Its gay parterres and summer flowers made it look like an island in the desert. A berceau, or covered walk, ran round it, shaded with creeping plants, amongst which honeysuckles and jessamines were intermixed, en treillage. The trees were loaded with fruit. The myrtles and fig trees were flourishing in luxuriance, and the scarlet geraniums, July flowers, and orange trees were in full blow. My native country can boast of no such beauty as bloomed at Château Hougoumont. Its rugged clime produces no fruitful fig trees, no flowers rich in the fragrance of orange blossom, but it is the land of heroes. Man is the nobler growth our realms supply, and souls are ripened in our northern sky. I saw the pure and polished leaves of the laurel shining in the sun, and I could not restrain my tears at the thought that the laurels, the everlasting laurels which England had won upon this spot, were steeped in the heart-blood of thousands of her brave, her lamented sons. But if not immortal in their lives, they will be so in their fame. their laurels will never wither, and no British heart, henceforward, will ever visit this hallowed spot without paying a tribute of veneration and regret to those gallant spirits who here fought and fell for their country. At the garden gate, I found the holster of a British officer, entire, but deluged with blood. In the inside was the maker's name, Beasley and Hetze, No. 4, Parliament Street. All around were strewed torn epaulets, broken scabbards, and sabre-tatches stained and stiffened with blood, proofs how dreadfully the battle had raged. The garden and courts were lined during the engagement with Nassau troops as sharpshooters who did great execution. A poor countryman, with his wife and children, inhabited a miserable shed amongst these deserted ruins. This unfortunate family had only fled from the spot on the morning of the battle. Their little dwelling had been burnt, and all their property had perished in the flames. They had scarcely clothes to cover them, and were destitute of everything. Yet the poor woman, as she told me the story of their distresses, and wept over the baby that she clasped to her breast, blessed heaven that she had preserved her children. She seemed most grateful for a little assistance, took me into her miserable habitation, and gave me the broken sword of a British officer of infantry, most probably of the 145th Guards, which was the only thing she had left, and which, with some other relics before collected, I preserved as carefully as if they had been the most valuable treasures. It is a remarkable circumstance that amidst this scene of destruction, and surrounded on all sides by the shattered walls and smoking piles of this ruined and roofless abode, the little chapel belonging to the chateau stood uninjured. Its preservation appeared to these simple peasants an unquestionable miracle, and we felt more inclined to respect than to wonder at the superstitious veneration with which they regarded it. No shot nor shell had penetrated its consecrated walls. No sacrilegious hand had dared to violate its humble altar, which was still adorned with its ancient ornaments and its customary care. A type of that blessed religion to which it was consecrated, it stood alone, unchanged, amidst the wreck of earthly greatness, as if to speak to our hearts, amidst the horrors of the tomb, the promises of immortality, and to recall our thoughts from the crimes and sorrows of earth to the hopes and happiness of heaven. The voice of the divinity himself within his holy temple seemed to tell us that those whom we lamented here, and who, in the discharge of their last and noblest duty to their country, had met on the field of honour the death that best becomes the brave, should receive in another and a better world their great reward. Blackened piles of human ashes surrounded us, but I felt that though the dust returns to the earth, the spirit returns unto him that gave it. The countryman led me to one of these piles within the gates of the court belonging to the chateau, where, he said, the bodies of 300 of the British guardsmen who had so gallantly defended it had been burnt as they had been found, heaped in death. I took some of the ashes and wrapped them up in one of the many sheets of paper that were strewed around me. Perhaps those heaps that then blackened the surface of this scene of desolation are already scattered by the winds of winter, and mingled unnoticed with the dust of the field. Perhaps the few sacred ashes which I then gathered at Château Hougomont are all that is now to be found upon earth of the thousands who fell upon this fatal field. It was not without regret that we left this ever-memorable spot, surrounded as it was by horrors that shocked the mind and vestiges that were revolting to the senses. Still we lingered around it, till at length, after gazing for the last time at its ruined archways and desolated courts, we struck into the wood, and lost sight for ever of the Château Hougomont. The road to Nivelles, which strikes off to the right from the high road to Genappe at the village of Mont-Saint-Jean, passes the chateau on the other side. The right wing of the British Army crossed this road, and in the deep ditches on each side of it, we were told that human remains still lay uninterred. Some of the party returned to Montsaint, Jean by this road, which is considerably nearer, but my brother, my sister, and myself once more crossed the field in order to pay another visit to La Belle Alliance. I could not be persuaded to go to see the skeleton of a calf which had been burnt in one of the outhouses of Hougoumont, and over which one of the ladies of our party uttered the most pathetic lamentations. It seemed to fill her mind with more concern than anything else. At another time, I might have been sorry for the calf, but when I remembered how many poor wounded men had been burnt alive in these ruins, it was impossible to bestow a single thought upon its fate. Finding that her sensibility obtained no sympathy from me, the lady turned to my sister and began to bewail the calf anew, till at last, wearied out with such folly, out of her grief and her impatience, she exclaimed, that she did not care if all the calves in the world had been burnt compared to one of the brave men who had perished here. As we passed again through the wood of Hougoumont, I gathered some seeds of the wild broom, with the intention of planting them at H Park, and with the hope that I should one day see the broom of Hougoumont blooming on the banks of the Tweed. In leaving the wood, I was struck with the sight of the scarlet poppy flaunting in full bloom upon some new-made graves, as if in mockery of the dead. In many parts of the field, these flowers were growing in profusion. They had probably been protected from injury by the tall and thick corn amongst which they grew, and their slender roots had adhered to the clods of clay which had been carelessly thrown upon the graves. From one of these graves I gathered the little wild blue flower known by the sentimental name of forget-me-not, which to a romantic imagination might have furnished a fruitful subject for poetic reverie or pensive reflection.